Welcome to the Dirtbags State of Mind podcast from the Climbing Zine. I am Luke Mehall, and this is episode 5 of season 8. The Dirtbags aren't dead, they're just in Mexico. This is a storytelling episode. We've had quite the season so far. I mean, this has really just been one of my favorite seasons, starting off with my all-time favorite climber, Chris Sharma. We had Ashima Shirashi on the podcast, and that was such a pleasure too. Followed by Carly Rager, which was just such a fun episode, and Carly talked at length about this climb, Carreras on La Gloria, and I just happened to be here in El Salto now. In many ways, that piece that she wrote and the one that Zach Clanton wrote in volume 24 lured me back here to El Salto, a place I hadn't been to in many years, and is really changing in some really cool ways, and such a cool climbing community here. We are switching up with this one. Started off being a storytelling podcast, and we've evolved into having interviews, but this one is my story from volume 26, the current zine, and it's part 2. Part 1 is in volume 25. This series, and I think some themes will be included in my next book, American Climber 2. But this series, The Dirtbags Aren't Dead, They're Just in Mexico. We all have seasons in our life and seasons with climbing. We all evolve as the years go by, and we gravitate towards different things. The season I'm talking about in my life is really in my 40s, and picking your path, choosing your path. A lot of my friends started families in this time of life, and some a bit younger, but I've chosen not to have kids and chosen a life that is so close to climbing. Climbing is my career, and it's also my passion. And of course, there's so much risk for burnout when one makes such a decision. I love climbing so much, and I love our community, and I was really looking for, I guess, more of a analog life, you could say. And I think that when you are a person who is living out I don't want to say a solitary life, but a life without children, I think there's the risk of loneliness and isolation. And in this world that's increasingly moving towards digital and AI and all this bullshit, I wanted to just be closer to other humans, and I really find in Mexico, starting with Potrero Chico, I was able to just find a place where people were hanging out at picnic tables and playing cards and just really simple things that enhance my life. My friend Andy Vo, Mr. Vo, talks about the third spaces, like in your day-to-day life, between work and home, where are these third spaces? And I find more fulfillment in the third spaces of places like Potrero Chico and El Salto, and there's many places in many countries that are like that, but I've just gravitated towards these communities, and it's really given me a lot of purpose in these last 4 or 5 years. And I've had some crazy experiences, and I think especially in this second one, there was basically a near-death experience where I was almost crushed by a rock, and it was parallel with the decision we made to bail. And if we wouldn't have made that decision to bail, this rock, there's a good chance it would have hit me or my rope. And we'll get into that in the story. One last thing here in the introduction that I want to mention is throughout the Dean Potter Dark Wizard documentary that's really traveling through the world, and even in the mainstream, not just climbers, but there's so much talking about mental health and how those resources weren't available in the past, and we kind of like self-medicated on nature. And I certainly did that a lot, and the Dean Potter documentary was triggering, but also gave me insight into how I've chosen to have a therapist who's an expert on trauma in the outdoors, and I've just chosen to really embrace my vulnerability. For some people it's through talk therapy, through some people it's through other means, but I think just before I did therapy, I would just try to do that through writing, and I'm going to still continue to do that, of just highlighting the highs and the lows of the climbing experience. And through 27 years, I think it becomes more apparent that we have to highlight both. We can't just highlight the send. Many more thoughts on that. Maybe I'll do a full kind of breakdown of the Dark Wizard at one point in a podcast or in writing, but just wanted to share that with everyone here at the top. The final message I have is that we are in the midst of our Sell Out the Zine campaign, and you can subscribe at shop.climbingzine.com, and you can score a free copy of Volume 25. We've got about 25 copies left for this sale. So go to shop.climbingzine to subscribe, and you'll get Volume 25 and 26 in your mailbox until this sale ends. So maybe check out our website to see if it's still going if you're listening to this at a later date. This episode is brought to you by Patagonia. Patagonia is proud to introduce the Free Wall Kit. 6 pieces to help you rest hard and climb harder on the most sustained multi-pitch objectives. Designed to meet the demands of their ambassadors' evolving tactics for cutting-edge multi-pitch objectives, the Free Wall Kit prioritizes protection and recovery so you can focus on performance. Each piece is built with features to make the most of marginal rest so you can get back just enough energy for the send. Check out the full kit at patagonia.com. This episode is also sponsored by Kilter. Looking for a fun way to train at home or at the gym? Check out the Kilter board. Kilter board has an innovative light-up holds, a progressive app, and animated functions with climbs for all abilities and multiple layouts to choose from, with large online communities for each. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you know that Kilter has been a long-term sponsor, and you can now get a discount on a Kilter board by being a listener. There are flat rate savings. The larger the size, the larger the discount, ranging from $500 to $800 off. Use code ZINE at checkout, and this applies to North American customers only for the full ride, mainline, and auxiliary kits. For more information, check out settercloset.com or look in our show notes. This episode is brought to you by Osprey. Located just down the road from the Climbing Zine headquarters in Cortez, Colorado, Osprey invites you to check out their Transporter series. Rugged, reliable, and designed for all forms of adventure, Transporter travel carry solutions are made to be lightweight without sacrificing durability. Impeccable construction and functional design merge to produce bags capable of navigating both remote mountain ranges and urban environments with ease. Made from NanoTough, a durable, highly water-resistant fabric technology that protects your cargo, leaving no room for compromise. You can find the Transporter series at your local retailer or visit osprey.com. Let's get into my story. The Dirtbags aren't dead. They're just in Mexico, Part 2. I don't really know how the normal shit go, so I guess I'll just play it by ear. Silence is all that I hear. Listening as close as I can. Mac Miller, Wings. I know the sound of death from a falling rock, and it sounds like nothing. Well, at least this one did. The rock came from above, as it so often does in Potrero Chico. It presumably came from the climbing party above us. In this era of my climbing life, I made a habit not to climb below another group, especially in Potrero Chico, which is abundance of loose rocks and flakes. But this was a situation of circumstance. We were on Sendero Luminoso, the famous 512 test piece, made even more famous when Honnold free soloed it, a decade before on what we all know was training for his ultimate free solo, Freerider on El Capitan. When we started up, it appeared that we were the first party on the route, and there was a party on the newish route to the right called Sombre de Muerte, the Shadow of Death. The climbers were far off to the right, so I assumed we would not be in harm's way if they dislodged any rocks. But little did I know that Sombre de Muerte eventually converges with Sendero Luminoso and climbs right above it, which left us, unknowingly, in the shadow of death, indeed. In a way, Sendero Luminoso could be considered the Freerider of Potrero Chico. I'm constantly amazed and impressed by how many climbers are successful on this route. During the busy season, it seems like there's always at least one party on it. Sometimes when I'm having dinner at my favorite restaurant, Checo's, I'll step outside and see headlamps high on the wall, and I'm content to be in the horizontal with my amigos and my chips, rice, beans, chicken, and guacamole for dinner. Getting high on tall walls consumed my life for so long, it's been interesting to ponder what to do next with my athletic and aesthetic aspirations. I could feel the urge to be hanging from a harness 1,000 feet off the deck waning, but I wanted Sendero Luminoso to be the last one. The last great big multi-pitch climb, and then I would retire from the big walls and only experience them in treasured memories and stories, the safest of all big wall experiences. 1 year before this, almost to the date, I had no such inclinations of retirement. I was experiencing a resurrection for my love for Potrero Chico and warm rock in the winter. I've been doing a different kind of climbing, out of a hole of depression and loneliness in the aftermath of calling off an engagement during the pandemic. And as it had so many times before in my life, I turned to climbing in the community for salvation. While once Potrero Chico had been an exotic land that seemed so far from home, now, 17 years later after I'd first been there, it was like walking through a familiar door, one that opened up into an abundance of sunshine and rocks that was leading me back home to my purpose in life. All positivity aside, I was still aware that on each and every climbing day, we could die doing what we love, even the most innocent-seeming days, and especially on those days. This was one of those days. It was February, but summer had already seemed to be in the air. It was a simple day of cragging with a woman that I had a crush on. We were in Virgin Canyon, which gets maximum shade this time of year. The air was hot, but the rock was not. It was our 9th pitch of the day, and I decided just to top rope it. I climbed up the immaculate gray rock, feeling woozy from the heat, but in harmony with how much time I'd been spending on the rocks that winter. While getting lowered down, I noticed a loose rock on a ledge. It was about 15 feet up. As one who established new routes and maintains existing routes, I'll usually take action when I see something sketchy. But for whatever reason, perhaps the heat, and perhaps the fact that I was just thinking about what would happen next with this beautiful woman, I did nothing about this rock. When I hit the ground, there was a group next to us in the classic Don Quixote, a cryptic and iconic corner. We all exchanged pleasantries and chatted it up. At this locale, more than in most sport climbing areas, we were there for the vibes, and everyone seemed to be feeling good. I pulled the rope and it got stuck 15 feet above me on that ledge. I should have known better, and instead of thinking about why it was stuck, I simply pulled harder on the rope. When I did so, it dislodged the rock that I noticed, and it landed directly on my head, hitting my helmet, which took the brunt of the impact. And then it hit my shoulder, and then my chin. The crowd around got all silent, and the attention was focused on me. I was profoundly embarrassed. I can't exactly remember what happened next, but I remember whatever person that was around had the most medical experience did a quick check. Other than the cut on my chin, I remarkably didn't have a visible major injury. Deep down, I knew that if I wasn't wearing my helmet, I would be on the ground, getting an assessment for a traumatic brain injury, and likely heading to the hospital far away in Monterrey. I was concussed, but I was feeling the feeling that we climbers get when we find ourselves narrowly avoiding tragedy. Lucky to be alive, but with no real explanation. Sure, I had my helmet on, but it was that point in my climbing career where I started to feel naked without my helmet on. Many times in the past I wouldn't wear my helmet while top roping, but luckily I'd switched over. Any day you go climbing can be your last. Any day you're alive could be our last. It doesn't feel real until something real happens. And that next day, and the many days after, when I felt my head cloudy and off from the concussion, I knew I had been lucky. The sensations from the aftermath of getting hit in the head by the rock lasted for several weeks. Days turned into weeks, into months, into Potrero. My passport expired while I was there, and I had to renew it in the consulate in Monterrey. It was a strange feeling not to be able to go back to the United States when I wanted to. All my life, I felt a sense of home more in the places where I climb than where I live. And Potrero was providing that sense of home, even if I was in another country and the locals spoke a different language. As the season went on, the gringos went back home, and the pools there, normally empty in the climbing season, filled up. The scene in Potrero Chico became completely different. And I also had my work to keep me company. I've doubled down in life on climbing, being that as my passion and my career. There are some downsides, like really I get tired of people talking about climbing, but climbing is also infinitely interesting and challenging. I don't regret my career choice, or rather the career that chose me, because nothing else seemed to stick. The hardest part of my job and passion is the never-ending accidents and loss of life. That spring, I found out my friend Meg O'Neill had lost her life in an ice climbing accident. At first, that was all we knew. I really despise how we find out about death in this modern era of smartphones and social media. Little bits of information that may or not be true delivered to us when we think we're just doing some casual scrolling. There's no good way to get this news, but I always prefer a phone call from a friend with the details. A couple days later, Tim Folks and I spoke, and he shared a more complete picture of what had happened. Meg had saved the life of another when she was killed by a giant ice pillar. She saw the pillar break and watched that it was aiming to land on the belayer. She immediately took action, pushing the belayer out of the way, saving her life, but losing her own. I cried deeply and profoundly for my friend, who died a hero's death, mixed with the sadness of losing a friend. Meg was an ever-present part of our Indian Creek family, our crew that gathered, sometimes in very large numbers, in the spring and the fall there. She was a teacher, always living a life of service. And in her final act, she left us all with a profound lesson. The loss of a fellow climber was sometimes personal, and other times it was not. Sometimes through the zine, it was helping memorialize someone through story, often someone that I'd heard the legend of but had never met. I've had countless conversations with wives that have lost their husbands, parents who had lost their children, and those who had lost their most treasured climbing partners. I always feel like it's an honor that people will trust me to create a dedication to those we've lost, and I always come away with the sense of the fragility of life. Potrero Chico has seen its share of accidents and fatalities. These things often happen in waves. Each and every accident I am near to affects me in one way or another, and it always causes me to reflect on my relationship with dancing on the rock. Something so silly, yet so profound. When the accidents pile up, my nervous system will go into high alert. I become sensitive to the dangers around me. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, like the time I pulled a rock on myself, and other times it is a fellow climber that can pose the threat. One lesson I've learned through this continual cycle of life-affirming moments, and ones where death seems to be close, is that our interconnectedness as humans and climbers is pivotal. My friends that have passed on through climbing or other risky outdoor sports continue to live on through me, through my own climbing, and through my interactions with others. I try to take care and caution as much as possible, and the more time goes by, the more I realize I risked before I realized how much I was actually risking. As my mid-40s approached, I became obsessed with getting stronger, while my appetite for risk and discomfort diminished. In Potrero Chico, I also found myself constantly meeting new people, getting to know them, and realizing which people I wanted to trust my life with. For each and every climbing day we tie into a rope with a partner, we trust them completely with our lives. Felipe was a new partner, but we connected in a way that made me wonder if we were friends in a past life or something. Perhaps we just shared similar interests in first ascents and a love for climbing movement. But whatever it was, we were in sync from the moment we tied in together at the Surf Bowl on an early season October afternoon. Felipe is a leading Guatemalan climber and guidebook author, but he carries himself with a low-key vibe, so it took a while to learn this information. Once I saw him on the rock, I realized how strong he was, and how he was my kind of climber. Humble, strong, smart, competent, and kind. On the first day of climbing together, we realized we shared a passion for first ascents, and just days later, we established a new route together, Johnny Utah, a short but fun erect climb with a cryptic crux. Once that was done, I had another one in mind, one that I had been thinking about for a year, a stunning path up an orange face on the backside of the spires. A new line is like a new person in your life. You never really know it until you spend time together and get to know the little details and characteristics. The overstoker syndrome can always apply to new routes. The enthusiasm is there, but the ultimate test is how does the line climb? Is it independent? Is the rock good? Like choosing a lover, the more time goes by, the more picky I get about the new lines I want to establish. Felipe and I bonded over this line, which we would later name Viento de Primavera. Felipe had that look in his eyes when he saw it, the same one I must have had, a king line, hiding there right in plain sight, just waiting to be seen. While once my favorite thing in climbing was a big wall with the perfect partner or two, I now find that similar passion in establishing a route at my limit with said partner or two. Flash forward 1 year, and the line was bolted and ready for the first free ascent. I was nowhere near close to it, but Felipe, being Felipe, had the strength and was entering the flow state. He was close. The face of the rock gets maximum sun, so the time to climb the route is either early morning or in the evening. We were gathered there with a crew, some of us working on Viento de Primavera, and others climbing the one to the left of it called Pangea. It was the weekend of Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, a Mexican holiday that celebrates and remembers those who have died. It is difficult to describe a feeling and a vibe from a culture that is not your own, but something otherworldly seemed to be present that evening. Consider this quote from the Mexican Museum about Dia de los Muertos. Those who passed on are alive in our memories, a continuous echo that at certain occasions becomes louder. As the only answer to many of our questions, death is an integral part of life, and the living and the dead meet on this day to emphasize the importance of death in the cycle of life. As the darkness was approaching, there were quick draws that needed to be cleaned on Pangea. A chaotic energy surrounded what was a very simple task. I remember a climber going up but unable to clean all the quick draws, and then someone else had to go up. By the time he was tying in, it was pitch black. The climber chose not to wear a headlamp and also climbed in approach shoes on someone else's new rope. His belayer, in his early 20s, new to Potrero Chico, belayed him with an ATC. The calm of the early evening, with Mexican music playing in the background, was quickly interrupted with a violent fall. In that moment, I was certain it would end in death. I remember seeing Felipe out of the corner of my eye and sensing he was experiencing exactly what I was. My nervous system told me that this would be the worst, most serious climbing accident I'd ever seen with my own eyes. But as soon as I looked up, the climber was dangling exactly 2 feet off the ground. He had fallen from the very top of the route to the bottom, probably 65 feet or so. I was immediately angry, enraged, but I remained quiet. This was not my battle to fight. The belayer and the climber exchanged some words to ensure they were okay. Miraculously, they were. My nervous system was warning me of death, but this was near death. The climber walked away intact. What I witnessed next was very beautiful and heartwarming. The climber calmly said something to the effect of, "Well, everything is okay in this universe." What I took it to mean that maybe in a parallel universe, the fall wasn't stopped, and we were all dealing with a serious accident. But on this planet, in this place, all was okay. The climber and the belayer embraced, and then, as a group, we began to debrief the situation. Though my nervous system was still telling me something was wrong, tragedy had been averted once again. The feeling in the air was that a miracle of sorts had happened. And as the group stood in a circle, a gang of miscellaneous climbers that would be together in this moment and never again, egos were pushed aside and then analyzed. The belayer had been using a gree-gree and then switched to an ATC for this particular belay. The rope was new and didn't belong to the climber or the belayer, so neither one had a sense for its feel. The climber wasn't using a headlamp or climbing shoes. All of these details were brought up and thought about. My only point of feedback was for the belayer to buy his own gree-gree or auto-locking device. He only owned an ATC at the time. One wild detail in the fall was that the climber realized his fall wasn't being stopped when it should have been, and he grabbed the other end of the rope and slowed down his own fall. He made 3 attempts to do this, and each time he did, the rope severely burned his arm. But these attempts did slow the rope down. In the end, after so much rope was quickly sliding through the belay device, the belayer was finally able to stop the fall, 2 feet off the ground. Near misses don't change lives the way accidents and fatalities do. But when you think the worst is going to happen and it doesn't, it seems to almost slow time to show that time is relative. One point of clarity that I walked away from this one is that it is always the climbers and the climbing and not the climb that really matters. Like many climbers, I can get so obsessed with the climb. But in the end, it is the climb that represents something bigger than ourselves, a goal, a way to grow, a way to experience strength, trust, and friendship. Back to Sendero Luminoso. Jeremy and I were at the top of Pitch 4, where a palm tree grows out of the rock. While this was our first time doing a multi-pitch together, we'd known each other for years, and there was an instant connection of trust and skills and abilities. I struggled with the second pitch crux, and after taking 10 or so small falls trying to figure out the move, I asked Jeremy to lower me back down to the belay. He went up and figured out the move, which to me felt like a cryptic crack climbing crux, and he was able to do it his second try. I was impressed, and I was psyched we were going to continue up. Our goal that day was to climb the first 5 pitches, all 512, and then rappel back to the ground, a recon mission. The climb had lived up to the hype, a stunning slab of gray limestone, and every once in a while I would think about Alex Honnold free soloing it, especially when I would encounter a flake or something that didn't seem too solid, to think about a man trusting his life to it. Months later, when I got to interview Honnold for our Dirtbags State of Mind podcast, which you're listening to right now, I got to ask him about it. I'd climbed several of the big routes that he had free soloed, including most of the pitches on Freerider. But for some reason it was Sendero Luminoso that seemed the most unfathomable. Honnold countered that the sections on El Cap were way more delicate and challenging than anything he experienced on Sendero Luminoso, because on Sendero Luminoso there were holds. And it was hard to argue with that. But up on Sendero, my head would spin every time I thought about it, and at each hanging belay, each uncomfortable moment way off the deck, I was realizing an internal truth of my own. This was not for me anymore. The countless hours I'd spent at hanging belays, eating bars and gels, dehydrated, pooping in tubes and bags, dodging rockfall, well, I'd simply had enough. And I knew I'd had enough before I was even up there, but I wanted Sendero Luminoso on my tick list. Not necessarily because of my ego, although I'm sure the pesky ego is part of it, but because I wanted to experience being in that place. Maybe even sleeping a night up there on the bivvy ledge, looking below at a humble, dangerous place that changed my life so much and welcomed me in a way I would forever be grateful for. And perhaps that journey to climbing Sendero Luminoso would have continued if it wasn't for that rock falling faster than the speed of sound. At the top of pitch 4, we had one more pitch left in our goal for the day, the palm tree pitch. At the base of this pitch, by a swaying palm tree in the cool February breeze, we were both tired. It didn't take long to decide that we wanted to rappel down, come back, and fight another day. I've never had a problem with bailing and not achieving the goal for the day. If you come down, you can always go back up, was a line an older climber told me once that I'll never forget. Shortly after we made that decision, I had the strangest sensation I've ever had while climbing. Something seemed to touch me, and I looked down, and then I heard a rock whizzing by. It was moving so fast that we didn't hear it until it was below us. The rock went right by where we would have been if we would have continued to climb. We looked at each other and said the things that climbers say when something like this happens. I don't remember our dialogue as much as I remember what I thought. I would have been the one leading, so the rock would have struck me or my rope or both. And I visualized the rescue if I had died. Jeremy would have had to rappel down with my body if it had remained on the wall, or rappelled down by himself to get assistance. In that moment, I knew this chapter of my life, this book, had concluded. I saw the hand of God, and on that day, things were in our favor. I knew I had gotten away with so much risk in my life, anchored to big walls, and I knew I didn't want to take those sort of risks anymore. Retirement in climbing doesn't really exist. In fact, I still love it as much as I ever did. I just like to move on the rock in different ways than I used to. Actually, many of us hit our prime at ages when mainstream professional sport athletes are long retired. There's a spiritual, mystical, otherworldly side of climbing that big walls have exposed me to. I can't say I'm any wiser for it, but I will say all those years have given me patience and grace that I never would have accessed. Watching for the signs, listening to the mountain, understanding that we were never meant to live in a way that modern society has molded us. I think of my own close calls and the ones I've seen happen to others. And I think of my friends now on the other side who didn't survive, those crushed by ice, rocks, and avalanches. I hope it was painless, and I hope it was quick. That was The Dirtbags Aren't Dead. They're Just in Mexico, Part 2. Rereading that, so much flashes through, but especially my friend Meg O'Neill, who saved another's life in that moment. Like I wrote in this essay, I was just severely emotional because Meg could have acted differently and could still be here. She chose to save another's life and give her own, and it's just the most powerful lesson ever. There's a couple of great photos of Meg in the zine that Sean McLean provided. Meg loved ice climbing, and she loved Indian Creek, and she especially loved number 1 sized splitters in the creek. That's one thing we always joked about with Meg. She was always seeking those out. I wish we could have had more time with Meg, but grateful for the time that we had with her. This story is from Volume 26, and as I always say on the podcast, the best way to support this podcast is to subscribe to the Climbing Zine. You can look at it as like a companion to the podcast. We like to share a story or two online and in the podcast, but the majority of the content is kept exclusively in the zine, and we actually expanded the page count to 164 pages. It is beautiful, if I do say so myself. And if you're listening to this, and you might be able to still take advantage of our sale to score a free copy of Volume 25 when you subscribe, so you could get 25 and 26. Check out shop.climbingzine.com or look in our show notes. Music from this episode is by Devin Dabney. Devin's got a great feature in Volume 26. And we're also working on the second edition of our mixtape series that we're going to release here shortly. Our digital editor and producer is Chad Rich, and signing off from Ciénaga de Gonzales, El Salto, Mexico, I'm Luke Mehall. Peace.